So a big warm welcome to everyone who is joining this webinar about ways finding. So I'm Mikael Göte, work at CRISP in Stockholm. So with me I have Sonja Blignaut. Maybe you could just say a few words about yourself, Sonja.
Thanks, Michael. I'm based in South Africa, as my accent will probably give me away. I live in Pretoria, close to Johannesburg, and yeah, I've always loved these collaboration with CRISP. So thanks for setting this up, Michael.
Great, and we have a big international crowd. That's fantastic. And of course, we appreciate when if you have your camera on. That's feels a bit more interactive for us speaking rather than just talking out to the cyber space. So if you can have your camera on and interact, we love it. But also we understand people are maybe eating breakfast or going to the office or not able to. So that's fine too. Okay, Sonja, let's start the session here. And just to say that we will present for about half an hour or so, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for a Q&A, and we will end by 8:45. That is Central European time.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so it's not a lot of time, so I'm going to try and be quick. So if I'm too fast, just kind of, raise a hand and I'll try and slow down a bit. So today is very much just an introduction to some of the thinking around the Waysfinder. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of insight into the context where it emerged from, some of the theories and the inspiration for it, and then also, one or two newer developments, and then Michael will also talk a little bit about ways that they have applied it in CRISP. So I'm just going to start. Just need to get my presentation up here. Okay, so today it's all about ways finding in complexity, and maybe the first place to start is with that S. I think many of you would be more familiar with the notion of wayfinding, and I put that S into the ways finder, with very intentionally, because in complexity there's always multiple ways that we can find, and I find that that kind of linear way of interacting with the world kind of tricks us into wanting to find the one way, and so I put that S in quite intentionally, just for that purpose. And so I wanted to start with a quote. This has become one of my favorite quotes because I find it resonates really deeply with where I am and my own experience in the world. It's by Zach Stein, who says, "We're in a time between worlds, a major world historical moment of transformation, where one world is the old world is passing away and the new hasn't emerged yet." And I don't know about you, but I can feel this. It's almost I've got like a somatic experience of this, and I'm encountering it everywhere. So this sense of change, I really love how Bridges makes a distinction between change events and transition processes. And almost everybody I know are in the midst of multiple transition processes. And that includes the corporates that I work with, so teams, companies, countries, individuals are kind of all in these, almost want to say, multiple cocoons at the same time. And so everything is changing, but we're not entirely sure where we're going yet. And in this space, it's kind of this edge of the known and the unknown, where there are no maps, and our, what the compasses that we used to rely on seem to be spinning erratically. We can either stay stuck where we are, wander around aimlessly, or we can find new ways to navigate. And again, I'm seeing all of these options being exercised. Many organizations, many teams feel quite stuck. They are clinging to the status quo, or they are trying different things that's not working. They're almost trying to use the old maps and the old compasses. in an environment where those are no longer useful. And so wandering around aimlessly. And so the Waysfinder is a way to help us find new ways to navigate the unknown. I liken it to switching on a searchlight. If you're in that messy entanglement of complexity, and especially in the messy tangle of multiple transitions happening at the same time, the Waysfinder is a way to kind of just switch on a light and to help you gain some traction and some focus. And so maybe just a little bit of background before we jump into the framework itself. Someone in a recent course described it as deceptively simple, and I quite liked that, because it's quite a simple framework and a simple approach for navigating complexity. And I think, once again, this was quite intentional. I don't think that very complicated frameworks and complicated approaches are helpful when we're trying to navigate complexity. We don't have to meet the complexity with complicatedness. And sometimes when people ask me, like what my life's mission is, one of my answers is I want to democratize complexity thinking, because I've been working in this field for a little over 2 decades. And I believe that there is so much value that sits in that world of complexity theory, but very often it's shrouded by academic language or by, it's almost been mysticized to some extent. And so a large part of what I'm trying to do is to make it accessible and provide simple ways of interacting and navigating with it. So it's got its foundations quite firmly in various theories. These include complexity theory, ecological psychology, constraints and affordances. And then I've also drawn quite extensively from more ancient wisdom traditions like the Polynesian Wayfinders. And then it applies various complexity principles. And as I talk you through the framework, you'll start seeing this. So these include moving from the present. In complexity, we only really have some control over the now, over the present moment. So setting an intention or a direction is always good, but then remaining in the present is very much a way of being in complexity. Then we set direction, not very rigid or specific goals and targets. Those are really helpful when we're in complicated or ordered contexts, but in complexity, they don't really help us. They almost become like blinkers. Safe to fail experiments, you'll probably be familiar with, but when we are in complexity, we need to experiment and learn as we go. Messy coherence is a term that I first heard from Dave Snowden. And it's this idea of allowing for messiness, not trying to find coherence, not trying to make everything ordered, but to bring some kind of coherence to the messiness. So we maintain some diversity, for example, but within guardrails. Enabling emergence, adaptation based on fast feedback, complex adaptive system adaptation is kind of built into that. And then managing constraints and fractality is also something that is very much part of the Waysfinder, because you can use the same framework on multiple different levels, especially if you're applying it in an organization or a corporate. But hopefully some of this will become a bit clearer as we actually go through the framework. And then maybe just one last comment here is, I love this quote by David Cooper-Ryder. He says, "We live in the world our questions create." And the Waysfinder, you'll see very often, is the way it's presented is through a series of questions. And they're quite simple questions, but what they evoke is not as simple. So it's more about asking the right questions than providing the right answers, which is, something else that I've learned in complexity is our questions are always valuable, but our answers are quite transient because everything is changing all the time. I don't know if you've got anything you'd like to add, Michael, before I jump into the framework.
No, I think we are all excited to go into the framework. So I think, the questions will come after that, I think.
Okay, cool. So I'm just going to basically talk you through the Waysfinder in quite a linear way, but when we use it in a workshop context, for example, we don't always follow this linear path. We kind of, see what is needed in the moment and, follow that progression. But what the Waysfinder is actually designed to do is create a contained option field. Because especially when we're in the midst of complexity, sometimes we can feel quite overwhelmed by all the options that's available to us. It can feel overwhelming and really confusing if we don't have some kind of container within to explore. And that is also then what makes our experiments safe to fail. So we start by mapping our current reality. Where are we now? And here we've got multiple questions that I don't have time to take you through at the moment, but this really is looking at your current reality through multiple different perspectives and multiple lenses and confronting what is actually going on. Because very often what we find is there's a lot of denial around where we actually are. And this goes for individuals when we use it for individual coaching. And it also goes for teams and large organizations and large projects, large transformation projects. So where are we now? Because remember, we move from the present. Then from there, we go to setting direction. So what horizon are we heading towards? And this often evokes very interesting conversations because we're very used to setting goals. We're used to being quite explicit in terms of where we want to end up. Or on the other side, we create, almost like wishy-washy vision statements that don't really provide direction. So this often creates very interesting and useful strategic conversations. I've often seen organizations rethink, are we really clear on where we're heading? Or have we only set shorter term goals? So it also immediately brings a bit of a longer term vision. The Polynesians, one of the sayings that they have, or the beliefs that really resonate with me, is they say, tie your waka, which is their name for a canoe, to a star, not to a glowworm. And so this really is around, in the longer term, where are we heading? What is it that brings us alive when we're using this with individuals, for example, is a question we'd ask. So once we've looked at our current reality and we've set direction, we move to looking at what are the guardrails we want to put in place. And there are two kinds of guardrails. The first is what I like to think about as limits. So in complexity language, these would be constraints that inhibit. These are typically things that we can't do anything about. We need to work within them. So a question here could be, where can't we go? And some of these limits are quite legitimate. So these could be things like laws that we can't contravene, or they could even be, things like corporate policies. But on other times, they are perceived limits. They could be, in an individual context, limiting beliefs, or they could be processes or policies in organizations that we actually do have some control over. So this conversation around guardrails is very useful in terms of challenging assumptions. And often people ask me, why do we even go to this word limit? Why do we go to these, limiting guardrails, so early in the process? And I find it really useful to just, externalize them, to articulate them, because these are typically the things that later on almost become excuses for us, or they become the reasons why we can't innovate, or the reasons why we can't explore. So it's really useful to get them out into the open. Then the second kind of guardrail, these I call boundaries. And these are guardrails that we choose. So they serve the purpose of creating safety and creating focus while we explore. So the questions here would be, where do we choose not to go? So often these are linked to values. So for example, in one of my clients, it's a mining environment, and they are exploring becoming, more bionic, or, including more artificial intelligence and robotics, etc., in their operations. but a clear guardrail, and it might even be one that sits under the limits for them, would be nothing we do can compromise safety. That would be an example. In one of the individual clients I'm working with, an example of a boundary would be, everything I do, it needs to be regenerative. I no longer want to participate in, the capitalist way of doing things. So often these are linked to either values or to things that we simply choose not to explore at the moment, because otherwise we are back in that space of where there are too many things to explore. And in corporates, what's really interesting is very often they haven't even thought about these guardrails. And that leads to a lot of overwhelm and a lack, and it leads to a lack of coherence. So this basically creates and you'll see my hands do this all the time, it creates almost like a cone of coherence. It creates this contained option or affordance field that we can now safely explore. And so next we go to what are options that we can explore within this space. And there are typically two kinds. We can explore adjacent possibilities. So steps that's, quite close. It's a little bit like crossing a river on stepping stones. We can see an option that's quite easy for us to explore, and we can take that step and see what happens. Or we can explore edge options. So those are further out on the edges, but because our guardrails are there, they're still safe to explore. So these are safe to fail experiments. Then we look at what are the resources we need, and typically these emerge as we start exploring. Sometimes these could be, new skills that we need to acquire. So going back to the mining example, if we want to become bionic, then we would need skills, for example, in AI and robotics. We also need skills for how humans interact with these systems. We might need different relationships. If this is an individual coaching example, if we want to do a career change, we might need to grow our network into a new area. So this is all around thinking, what do we need for the journey? And then finally, and almost most importantly, is we need feedback. So this is not something that you do once for all and then it's finished. It's a living process. It's a living framework. As we start moving and we start exploring, we might find new options that cause us to shift our guardrails a little bit. Sometimes what happens is we keep bumping up against our guardrails, and then we need to question, did we put them in the right place? Sometimes something happens in the external environment or in our current reality that makes us need to revisit, is our direction still correct? Do we need to shift our direction a little bit? So feedback is really important, and this is also what makes our experiments safe to fail. Because as we start doing things, we're getting feedback to see, is it having a positive impact or not? Should we amplify or should we dampen? And so this is just a very basic introduction to the Waysfinder. When we implement this, whether it's in a coaching process or in a team format or in an organization, we customize the questions specifically to the context that we're in. But the basic foundation of the framework remains more or less similar. Michael, anything you want to add?
Maybe I could add another example of those guardrails, the more fixed ones at the bottom there. So working with the gaming company, working with Minecraft game. And for example, they say the game should be for all age groups. Families should be able to play this, all age groups. So abuse hard language or swear words and things like this is not allowed in the game. So that's kind of a fixed boundary for the whole game. But then each part of the game, they have different game pillars or different teams. They have their own principles or pillars, they call them. So within this part of the game, this is our principles that guide how we develop or which features we include, for example. So then they have direction for the overall game. They have a direction for their part of the game, and they have to kind of then be within the boundaries of the overall game.
Mm. And thanks for bringing that in, Michael, because I think from in a corporate context, and even, you know, if you're a friend of mine created or used the Waysfinder to create a not-for-profit community that has different you know, areas, that, you know, different parts. And one of the key applications for the Waysfinder, especially if you're working in a collective, is to create this context for, you know, messy coherence, going back to that word. But it's a way to distribute decision making, because within your broader framework, you know, so let's say this is a large strategic transformation project. You can have one framework for the entire project that has the overall direction and guardrails, and then each of the different teams or each of the different areas, so let's say, you know, it could be, you know, IT, marketing, sales, you know, however you want to look at this, they'll have their own little frameworks that fits within the larger framework. So this allows for some autonomy, while you are still within the overall guardrails. So you don't have to micromanage anybody. And this also brings then the coherence that we were looking for, and not alignment. Alignment strips any organization or team of its diversity and its resilience to some extent when you're in complexity. So we want to shift from alignment to coherence. So I'm just watching the time. I want to leave some time for Q&A at the end. So I'm just going to move on. I think the Waysfinder is simple to understand and it looks quite familiar. And as I said, it's presented as a series of questions. These questions are simple, but what they evoke is not so simple. So maybe just a few examples here. There's a realization often that we haven't truly acknowledged our current reality, and that we are in resistance or denial, and very often in complacency. So we force, to some extent, the person, the team, or the organization to really take a hard look at where they are. Often there's unclear direction. So it's either rigid goals or wishy-washy vision statements, or there are multiple directions and there's no coherence around where are we actually going. Often there's no articulated guardrails. And this undermines coherence, safety, focus, and agency. There's a lack of shared direction and guardrails, and this undermines the success of complex multi-team projects, because it almost makes it impossible to remain coordinated. Limiting beliefs and assumptions creates stuckness. Often when we use this in an individual coaching context, what gets raised as limits are not things like laws we need to abide with, or the example that Michael just gave. They are limiting beliefs. They are almost, you know, I can't do this. And you can, when you start questioning those, you know, you can get some really useful coaching conversations. And then often unnecessary risk is highlighted, because when we're exploring in complexity and we're in the unknown, running large initiatives versus safe to fail experiments can expose you to undue risk. And then very often they are unhelpful or no feedback mechanisms. So we have no data, no feedback from our environment, or even internal feedback to help us determine if we're exploring in the right direction. You know, very often in agile implementations, for example, you know, we have feedback mechanisms that tell us how a particular sprint is going, for example, or we do planning, PI planning every now and again, but we don't revisit, is this overall project actually still going in the right direction? Are we still busy building the right thing? So it also helps us revisit our feedback mechanisms. And then more or less finally, here is one of the more recent developments is, as I've been implementing this with different clients, I've realized that sometimes even the framework needs to flex and morph a little bit. So there are typically, you know, two other ways or two other visualizations or ways that you can apply it. And it's a little bit in a sequence or in a rhythm. So sometimes what I see is that it gets used more like a radar. So very often organizations, when they need to innovate and reinvent themselves, and individuals, when they are in the same position, they want to make a big change. They don't actually have any idea of what the direction is. They need to be exploring in multiple directions. And here the focus shifts to the guardrails, and they almost become like a circle. So that, this is why I call it a radar. So within your guardrails, you can explore in different directions until the direction that feels most alive reveals itself. And then it goes from being a circle to that kind of searchlight wedge shape that I've just spoken you through. So sometimes we start as a circle, move to the wedge or the searchlight, so now we are experimenting in a more focused way. And then sometimes when our direction becomes almost fully known, we know exactly where we're going, and we're no longer exploring as broadly. It almost becomes like riverbanks, and we shift from a focus on exploration to flow, still within our guardrails, still in our direction, but now we can start putting in milestones. We can have these shorter term goals. And here the feedback also becomes really important, because we need to remain aware of, the opportunities, or potentially, the threats that might cause us to have to open up that wedge again. So it becomes about awareness while we're in that flow. So these are different ways that you can use the Waysfinder. And what I've seen in different clients is they almost shift, depending on where they are, from the radar to the searchlight to the riverbanks, and then sometimes back again to the radar, and or to the searchlight. And so, Michael, I'm going to kind of hand over to you to talk us through some of these examples.
Yeah, so we have had many workshops and applying the Waysfinder in them. So here's an example of a leadership team that they had done a reorganization. They've decided on kind of the new structures, but now how do they implement it rather than just have it on paper? How would people react to the change, etc.? So we made a sense-making kind of exercise on the situational awareness first here. That's kind of the bottom of the cone. And then they explore the different direction, the different fixed boundaries, the things that the principles, the values that they wanted to have in the organization, and then options for kind of moving forward. And another very similar in another change initiative, how the organization can kind of drive major improvements across the organization. And this is an example of when I've used it in a career coaching situation. So someone's looking for a new job, and what kind of job, we have the direction, what are some things that is kind of out of bounds or not possible, and what are some kind of wants that they should be kind of in and containing the options. And then we explore and try different ways of moving forward, finding that ideal job. And we use it in our teachings a lot with my colleague Jenny here, for example, when we teach about strategy. It's so often that organizations, they have a strategy, but it's actually a plan. But the strategy should be a decision-making framework that kind of helps you taking decisions within those frames. And it should be based on the context. It should be based on where you want to go. And then the strategy is actually kind of also creating those boundaries for the organization. So it's not about having a plan. So that's super useful. I have another colleague, he's looking into how to use it now for training in evolving architecture for software development. So it's kind of any complex situation, it's super useful.
Yeah, and I have a client that picture bottom right. I really enjoyed how they put Waysfinder, it's like on their clothing for this workshop, but they used it for succession planning. And we very often use it for scaling as well. So when a startup needs to scale, how do they do that without becoming, the corporate that they don't want to become? Very often that's how they would describe it. And in coaching, we use it a lot for people who are in major life transitions. So either trying to find your next when you're coming up to retirement, or for example, if you want to many of the people who are on our current course are people who want to leave corporate. So how do you do that? How do you reinvent yourself? Is a question that comes up. A conversation we've been having with a friend of mine that's actually on this call is how do we help people navigate chronic illness, the complexities of chronic illness by using the Waysfinder. And then also, just large strategic transformation projects. How do we maintain coherence within the various teams? And so, yes, the big journeys start with small steps. And we have 2 ways that if you're interested to learn more, that you can. One is a 1-day course that we're running, Michael and I are running in November. And you can see there's a option there for you to get some discount. And then I'm running a somatic ways finding journey with a friend of mine called Miriam. And this is very much, kind of moving beyond the mind, because sometimes what we see is when we try and figure our way through the complexity, when we try and make sense with our minds, this is when we get stuck. So this is very much an embodied experience of wayfinding. And you can join our waiting list. We'll probably start another journey at the end of October. Or you can just contact us if you want to book a wayfinding workshop with your team. And then, Michael, I don't know if you want to talk about this quickly.
Yes, so me and some colleagues at CRISP, we are running a program. This is this 3rd consecutive year. It's called Leading in Complexity. So it's about how do we lead in complex environments and organize. So it's all about using this complexity. And you might recognize Sonja up here. She participated in the 1st season. And if you're joining this year, you will also get access to almost all of these recordings of these kind of really good thought leaders. You have Peter Senge here, for example, Jennifer Garvey-Berger, etc. And this year we have actually Gary Hamel, Jos de Block, NKC here, Peter Block, Erin Meyer, some fantastic audience here. So you will have link here and also there if you use the code CRISPFriend20, you get 20% off there.
Yeah, this is a wonderful event. I always try and make it. So if you have any opportunity to do so, please sign up. And then these are just, I think we'll send these slides out, Michael. So these are just places where you can go do some reading. And I think that is it from our side. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to see if there are any questions or comments.
Yes, we have Stefan. Do you want to share it unmute and share?
Yes. Hi, Sonja. Thank you for the presentation. Really interesting to hear. And I can also recommend the Leading Complexity. It was awesome last season. So my question is there anything in the framework that kind of warns you that you're not in a complex environment, that you might be using the wrong strategy and should use something more for ordered or complicated?
There's nothing, I think, specific in it, Stefan, but sometimes I use it with the Cynefin framework, for example. So sometimes what we do is we'd use Cynefin first to kind of understand, what are we dealing with? It could be part of, mapping the current state, or we just use it before to see, which aspects of whatever we're dealing with are complicated or complex. But on the other hand, I think if you do find, working through those questions, that your direction is fully known, you almost don't need to do any exploration. You already know how to get there. Then I think that will be quite a strong signal that what you're dealing with is not complex. So yeah. I didn't put anything specific in there for that, but I think that would be a very specific signal for you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Naresh, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah. Hi, Sonja. Thanks. It was a very brilliant session introducing us about understanding what a wayfinder is. You rightly said about it, very deceptively simple. I suppose it takes a bit of time to master the understanding about, getting the outcomes on this framework. Thanks for that. My one question is, how do we, is setting direction different from setting North Star in corporates?
Yes and no. I think it depends on how you set the North Star, because I think sometimes, I'll give you an example. I had a local client who had as their North Star bringing possibilities to life.
Okay.
Now that is so broad. It doesn't really give you direction because, you know, one of the key things that we try and do, so between direction and your guardrails, it almost gives you a way of prioritizing or of choosing what you want to explore and what you don't want to explore. So let's say, for example, my direction is I want to do more soul-aligned work. And one of my guardrails is I want more freedom. If I get offered a job in a corporate, I almost immediately know that I'm not going to take it because it's probably not going to be soul-aligned and it won't give me more freedom. But if my direction is not specific enough, I can't use it in that way. But then you also don't want it to be so specific that it's just a direction mimicking as a goal. So direction is actually, it's one of the key aspects of the framework, is getting that direction right. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the question. Evelyn.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really do love this framework. I have a question on the practicality of using it with larger teams. So if I think you do have a lot of very intense discussions on understanding where we are and where we want to set our guardrails. So if you have some 20 people in the room, do you break them down, and how do you bring all the opinions together at the end of the day? Because we have to create a shared understanding. Yeah. So.
Michael, do you want to take that one? I think you've done it with large teams a lot.
Yes, so I kind of shared I've shared the framework and then introduced it briefly, and then broken up in smaller subgroups in the organization. And it can either so often have been able to work it through completely, but having at least each group to try it out, to start working on it, and then you can kind of have a sharing to see what they've come up with the different groups and start consolidating it. So I've done it a couple of times like that. So yeah, introducing the old framework and having then small groups kind of working on a flip chart, mapping out things, and then kind of starting consolidate it.
And something else that I've done, Evelyn, is because sometimes if you've got a large team, there are sometimes sub-teams within that team, you know, so people who are looking after different areas. And so sometimes what I do also is have them work in those sub-areas and then look for similarities and differences across. And so I think, you know, a key thing there would be agreement on the overall direction and the guardrails, and then also clarity around where their own kind of mini Waysfinders fit in. And something that I didn't touch on in this presentation is when we're in a situation like that, one of the key feedback mechanisms we put in place is for these different parts of the team, or the different teams, if you're in a multi-team environment, to remain in sync. Because we're all taking small steps into the unknown. And sometimes what happens is one goes too far ahead and the others like stay behind. And in the end, you lose coherence. So staying in lockstep as we are exploring is a very important thing when you're in a team context. I think we've got time for another one question, maybe. I don't know if there's any.
So
Yes.
can we do a nested wayfinding, like, you know, a big wayfinder, and then, you know, in a multi-team environment, you know, just to be within the, you know, coherence of the guardrails, can we have multiple, you know, let's say one team is following the radar option, the other team is following the riverbank option. Can we have that?
Yes, you can, because, you know, the different teams are in different contexts. And I think
Exactly.
it's one of the key ways that you can use it, because that's what creates the coherence while maintaining the autonomy. And then the key is that everybody is still moving in the same direction within the same overall guardrails, but their own kind of mini directions and guardrails will be different because they're doing different things to move us into that direction. I hope that makes sense, Naresh.
Sure. Thanks, Sonja.
Anything else? Otherwise, I think we can end right on time, Michael. Andre, you have a question.
Good morning, Sonja. Shanti. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Sonja, you know, the most difficult thing I've had to do in my life is learn to play golf. So when I hit the ball, it goes straight and putting it in the hole. But I had to get the muscle memory of my whole body in sync to play. So with that context, the question I have is, I think the framework makes sense. My daughter's been on the course. I've seen her use it and take benefit from it. How do you build the muscle so that the consistency of the execution of this ways finding becomes a practice? And then I ask that question because I'm busy asking her to extend her muscle memory to do this. So that's my question.
And thanks for that, Andre. You know, it's so today we've only really spoken about the nuts and bolts of the framework, but there's an approach, and I almost want to, without sounding too esoteric, there's a way of being that underlies this, you know. And so there are skills, there are habits of mind, and I guess the only way to build that muscle memory is to do it. You know, yesterday we had one of our somatic ways finding sessions, you know, and we started by saying, if you're not moving yet, you're not ways finding. And so it really is around, you have to get out of that way of thinking or way of being where you want to plan everything out. And you have to start doing little things. You have to do wayfinding to learn the muscle memory to be a wayfinder. But this is one of the things that we cover in, you know, it's a very simple framework. It's one of the, it's one of my conundrums. You don't really need me to train you in the framework because it's simple. But the kind of the tools that bring it alive and the skills and the ways of being that build that muscle memory, I think that is where, you know, it's not quite as simple. But Andre, I think that's just a long rambling response to say you build the muscle memory by doing it.
Okay, so if you have any more questions, I think we have to take them offline. You can email us. We'll send out our emails. You will get all the links we've shared. You get the slides and you will get the recordings. So I'll send that out during the day. It will come from the info@crisp.se. So if you don't get it during the day, then check your spam filter there. So yeah, hope to see you again in the future, and thanks so much for joining us today. So thanks everyone.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Hopefully see you soon.